I'd start with the resolution. Go through, identify all the parts of the resolution, all the key words so I know what the topic is about. After that, we do a lot of brainstorming, right? We come up with a bunch of arguments. We do our normal research, right? After I do all the research and I figure out what arguments actually exist on the topic, before I ever think about making cases, standards, anything else, I begin frontline. I come up with blocks. Okay? Anyone have a clue as to why I might want to do that?
So like arguments more, if you can think of more blocks for a certain argument, it may not be the best one to do.
Perfect. So one of the reasons is I can figure out which arguments might be the strongest and I might want to run. Did you have an idea? Okay. Anything else? The other reason is, as I go through and I start making blocks, and the more research I do on the issues, I also start to see certain common themes. Okay? So, in terms of these arguments that we have listed, clearly we don't have the blocks, we're not really sure which ones are strongest, but let's assume that these are all really, really strong arguments, right? So, these are the arguments that out of the 20 I've researched, and I can come up with for the topic, these are the 7 that I thought might be the strongest arguments for the topic, right? That I might be able to defend. So, I don't want to write a case about a bad argument, right? So, I use these as my baseline. What common themes do you see between these arguments? Okay, so something about decrease violence. What else?
Decrease that.
Decrease that. Sure. Sometimes violence is death. You can also draw different impacts. So, sure. Increasing quality of life. Any other common themes that we can see? Alright. I would also probably, one of the deals with decreased suicide, I would also probably link that to this, and we'd probably do something about decreasing oppression as well, right? That frequently people who are more likely to commit suicide are oppressed in some way, bullying, etc. So I think that there's some common themes. So I know what my contentions are going to look like. Contentions have to link to a common standard, right? This seems like pretty good standards to me. Anyone disagree? We should decrease violence. We should decrease death. We should improve people's quality of life. We should decrease oppression. Simple, right? Now, the only thing we have to do, so we have our standard. Now, we have to find some way to kind of phrase it and make it fit as a holistic framework, right? What are the parts? What are the parts of a frame? So I'm going to say that there's 5 steps. Let's list what these 5 steps are for every framework. Well, 99% that people are likely to run in general. So you're saying there's a value. Alright, so this is my value.
Oh, define the word.
I'd say that would be in this section, most likely. What do you think that 1, 3, and 5 are? Just like body. Meta-ethics would fall in a category. Yes. Well, I hope people know that. So you do need to, at some point, to state that. Usually people would say like the resolution, like I affirm the resolution, and then after the framework, before the contention, they say, thus my position is that we should, decrease death by banning handguns, right? What do you think? Same thing, thesis, position. So, to kind of help you guys out real quick, you also need a resolutional link.
Wait, wouldn't the resolutional link be the word that you decided?
What do you mean the word?
Like people would say, ought, that'd be one, then two would be, the value would be more desired.
Well, precisely. It's usually a very simple sentence, right? And it's going to relate to the evaluative term in the resolution. So if the resolution says ought, for example, ought, defined as a moral obligation, might imply that the value should be related to morality, right? If it sits there and says something about just, right? Uses the word just. I might sit there and imply that that's going to lead to a value of justice, right? There's different resolutional links that you can come up with. They're all going to be predicated off of the evaluative term in the resolution now. The reason why that's important is justice and morality are both good things, right? It's going to be very difficult for me to stand up there and say morality is better than justice because justice is bad. That just seems kind of odd, right, to even try to do something like that. So it's not that justice is bad, it's that the resolution, what this debate is about, is not a question of justice because the resolution asks us to evaluate what we ought do, not what a just society should do. Make sense? For example. And as a result, morality is the evaluative term because ought is defined as a moral obligation. Make sense? If I can sit there and say that my value is more closely linked to the resolution than your value, I have a way to weigh between two extremely good things. Because otherwise, you're going to stand up there and you're going to try to make arguments like justice is bad or morality is bad, and that's going to be extremely difficult. Most people won't buy it. Make sense? So you need some resolutional link, and that's going to be based on the evaluative term. After that, very simple, you'll state your value. Okay? What comes after the value?
Is it a link between the value and the criteria?
Yeah, precisely. You have to have some sort of little marker link the value and the criterion. Okay? Makes a lot of sense, right? So, what do you think the final thing will be? Let's see.
Observations.
Observations would be separate. It's outside the framework. But it would be at the top of the case. You are right.
The link of the value and the value criterion has a resolution.
Well, you've already done the resolution link. And if the criterion links to the value and the value links to the resolution, I think you're pretty good there. What do you think?
So the conditional link to the criteria.
So you link the contention to the criterion via the impacts. Okay?
Cards of opposition.
So sometimes you'll have cards in this section, but a lot of times you'll have cards here too, which will lead to the criterion. So I'm looking for a very specific type of argument. Yes. Reasons to prefer. Specific. Well, there's going to be a lot of justifications here. These are very specific types of justification. So it's reasons to prefer. Okay? By the way, I'm using a lot of shorthand. If you guys have any questions about that, please raise your hand. If you missed something, let me know. Okay? So, let's discuss one of these concepts. Okay? We know that our value is going to be morality for this resolution. Alright? Someone pick a standard. What standard do you guys want to discuss?
Save lives.
Okay, so we should save lives. Criteria. The nice thing is, now you have a lot of options. You know what your value is, you know what your standard is. Now all you have to do is find some ethical theory that says it is moral to save lives. Who has an idea of an ethical theory that says we should save lives? Deontology. We should treat people as ends in themselves. We should not sacrifice some for the many. Right? What else?
Did you say utilitarian?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely would think of futile. Right? I think justice would be more of a value, but definitely people would sit there and say justice would imply that we save lives. So if the value is justice, I would go there too. You know? What else? Any of the social contract theories, maybe? That the purpose or the function of the government is to protect citizens? Maybe, right? Social contract theorists. Maybe roles, if you wanted to do the justice element, right? Because it would say behind the veil of ignorance, everyone would opt for the position that would save lives, right? Does that make sense? So, you see how all of these ethical theories, everything that people are teaching you guys here at camp, whether it's from electives, whether it's from your labs, whether it's your coaches who are teaching you about philosophy, all of these tend to link to this section. This is where you're going through and you're saying, in order to be moral, we should treat people as means to an end. In order to be moral, we should fulfill the greatest good for the greatest number. In order to be moral, the government needs to protect its citizens. Make sense? All of that will be description here. Because it's saying, in order to do this, we need to do this. Okay? Everyone with me? Sweet. So, that's the type of justifications or the warrants here. Sometimes people will make pretty intuitive links. Sometimes they will make that very lengthy. It depends on the ethical theory you choose to run. Depends on how much work you think you need to do. Maybe it's based on your circuit. Maybe it's based on a certain strategy you're trying to run. So there's a lot of flexibility here, but it does hopefully give you a place to start. In terms of reasons to prefer, okay? What do we think that reasons to prefer do? So that would be signposting, or like telling them. All of this is just framing. Right. You are telling us why this standard is the best standard. Okay? Now think of it this way. Utilitarianism. What's the common definition of utilitarianism? Right, the greatest good for the greatest number. That implies that there are lots of great things, right? That there are lots of good things. But we need to figure out which of those things is the greatest. What's the most important good, right? For this round, I'm going to say it's saving lives. So if someone wants to get up there and say, you know what, it's also a good thing to be honorable, I would sit there and say, you are right. Being honorable is a good thing, but saving lives is the priority. So even though what you're talking about is good, we should prefer my standard over another standard. Make sense? So you can weigh within the same ethical theory. That's one of the things we can do with reasons to prefer. You have a question?
Yeah. So if you have like the value of morality and criteria of like saving lives, like in like the structure of how you save, like at any point would you identify like using utilitarian calculus or using the object principles?
Yeah, so I would definitely establish that. I might not necessarily say utilitarianism, but at the same time, depending on the cards, depending on what I'm doing, I very well might, right? If I was using deontology, I might put a Kant card here. He might not necessarily specify deontology, but he would probably mention means to an end, etc., right? Cool. So that reminds me of something, but yes. So in terms of reason preferred, we can weigh between the same ethical theory, right? What's another way I can use a reason to prefer? Yes?
To provide defense for your argument.
Right. Precisely. So if I sit there and I know that the common framework for the negative is going to be deontology, right? A lot of their arguments just seem to go that way. And I want to use a utilitarian framework. I might say there's a reason to prefer my standard because a util-based standard is more calculable. It is better because the agent in the resolution is the government, and the government makes decisions based on util. It is preferable because of a lot of things, right? I'm making defense, so when they stand up and they read their framework, we already know that mine is preferable, right? In other words, do you guys kind of see how the reasons to prefer work? Does this make sense? So you've already established that your value is important to the resolution. We know the value, and we know how to achieve the value. This tells us the mechanism to achieve that theory, right? And the reasons to prefer tell us why this mechanism is the best mechanism for the debate round. Okay? Now, there's several common misconceptions. Okay? First one. Where in the framework should you discuss specific arguments of the resolution? Exactly. So if we're going to be talking about banning handguns, nowhere in this section, all of this framework, should we mention that we should ban handguns. Because if we already know that banning handguns is good or bad, there is nothing more to debate. Right? This is setting up the mechanism to evaluate whether banning handguns is good or bad. Does that make sense? So we shouldn't do that. The other big misconception that we see frequently is related to the criterion. So we've gone through and we've listed a specific ethical theory or philosophy, right? We've outlined that this leads to morality. Should I ever use that philosophy, such as utilitarianism, as my criterion? Why?
The criterion should go with a verb, noun phrase. That's something you can do to achieve the value.
Exactly. In addition, if I just state something like util as my criterion, what's that actually tell me? The problem with doing something like that is there are numerous authors who write on util, I don't know what that mechanism is, and I don't know what the greatest good is, right? So if you get up there and you say, you're protecting lives, and I say, I'm protecting the economy, how do we evaluate between the two? Then we have to have the debate. But if you had set this up first, now there's no confusion. We don't cause two ships passing in the night. Makes sense? We have direct clash. It'll make this round much simpler, less muddled. Judges will like you a lot more. Okay? So, recap. I always start by blocking out the topic, right? Well, we brainstorm the topic, we research the arguments, we block them out, and we find out what the good argumentation is. Okay? Generally, there will be lots of different common themes, and you can make different combination of intentions, right? Once we figure out what those are, then we go through and I list the common themes. Okay? And then I find an ethical theory that I'm comfortable with and think I can defend that links to that standard. And once I know the standard and the ethical theory, I come up with reasons to prefer, then my case is done. And I'm ready for a tournament. I have all my blocks, I have my framework, I'm ready to debate. Make sense? And the nice thing is, you know what? I want a new case. Cool. All I have to do to make a new case is, I'm going to pick a new standard. I know which arguments link to it. I just copy and paste, get a new ethical framework, and I'm ready to go again. So it makes it very simple if you do this process to go through and make multiple cases for both sides of the resolution. Make sense?
So when you're forming your cases, like writing the framework is the last step you do?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the problems I see is if people start by writing the frameworks, then they end up coming, and they tend to be great frameworks because you spend a lot of time developing it, right? That's awesome. The problem is if you make that framework, but none of the arguments that are truly good arguments on the topic link to it, then you're running this amazing framework, but none of the contention arguments you'll be able to win, and then you win your framework, but they win your case, which means they end up winning the debate, right? Because they can win under your framework. Does that make sense? So, if I can't defend the argument, I don't want to run it. Now, there are differences. There are definitely times when, like for example, searching critical apps and that type of thing, I might go about this process differently. But for 99% of the debate rounds that I do, this is how I would structure the round. If I was not running a critical case, this is the process for me. Okay? And I know this is the exact process Nikki uses as well. Right? So it kind of fits there. It definitely fits a util strategy for sure. It fits all the policy arguments. If people want to run counter plans, disads, that type of thing, those would be part of the brainstorming list that we did over there. They'd be part of the block list that we created. And so it all flowed together. Make sense? Okay. Any questions so far? Yes.
What's the best way to research and components for the framework?
Best way to research?
And put components for the framework. That's if you're going to have components for homework.
Okay. In terms of that, like, what specifically are you having trouble with when you say research? Like, are you having trouble finding out what philosophers exist?
Not
Or-
what philosophers exist, but like, I guess going through all the information to just like parts relating to value and criteria.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Like, for example, I know there was a topic that we did a couple years ago that literally was just John Rawls versus Misconceptions, right? So I picked up John Rawls' book. It's a pretty long book. And I understand that. It's kind of hard to figure out what part of it is really critical, right? A lot of times philosophers will go through and they will, bless you, they will give you certain steps that they say is necessary. So like Rawls will talk directly about, in order to be just, you need distributive justice, right? In order to be just, you need the veil of ignorance, right? And then they'll go through and they'll give very, very lengthy explanations of what that means, what that looks like, why that would be good, etc., right? But his entire book, in that case, would really be about those two principles, okay? So if I know it's about those two principles, that's probably what I'm going to pick, right? I still want to read the rest of the book because, like I said, the rest of the book is going through and explain the nuances, explain when you would apply it, when you wouldn't apply it, what the limitations of them are. They oftentimes will say, this is what someone else might say, this is why that's wrong, right? So they create great defense for this. So it's really good to go through a lot of the book, but for something like that, you read until you get to a part where they say, in order to be just, you do this. In order to be moral with Kant, you need to follow the categorical imperative, right? Here's what the categorical imperative is. Perfect. And then he'll go through and give a really lengthy explanation of all the limitations of that, how to apply it. He makes up a bunch of words and then goes on from there. See what I mean? So that's what I would do. You're really looking, because a lot of the ethical theorists, this is what they're trying to prove. Either linking back to justice or linking back to morality, right? If you're reading like Locke, for example, or Hobbes, in terms of social contract, the important thing to know is why was society formed, right? Well, they will go through and directly say society was formed for protection, or society was formed to protect rights, right? And then they'll go through and again they'll explain in lots of paragraphs and the rest of the book all the limitations and the proofs for that, right? So that's what you're looking for. You're looking for the direct link between morality and what they're saying to do. Okay? Everything else is phenomenal as defense. Does that make sense? And did you have another part of the question?
I guess like so most of it is from books and you can't find it online. Like I've been having trouble finding like links between my value criteria online that I could like cut as a blog.
To be perfectly fair, I really haven't looked online for a while, and I have access to a couple, like, I subscribe to Scribd and a few other things. I have access to JSTOR, so I'm not really sure where I'd go, and I generally go to, like, directly CourseGuard or someone else and pull up their book, so I'm just not as familiar with that. Maybe Google Scholar has a bunch. I'm just not sure because I haven't done that for a while. So when I competed, like, Google was brand new, so it was scary. Yeah, you guys are shocked? No, it's true. So we used a lot of books. I still have like an entire bookshelf of philosophy books.
We were told that we should use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online, and it's just a database with a bunch of articles on philosophy.
Yeah.
I don't know something that is that hard to encyclopedia.
What I like doing with that, with SCP is rather than having the cards directly from SCP, which for a couple people it's not too bad, but a lot of times what I like doing with that is I'll go there, learn about new philosophies such as determinism or naturalism or some other isms that I haven't heard, and they give good explanations of what specific theorists talk about, and I'll find one that I think is interesting, and then I search online for a book. And I've done that a couple of times. For example, with naturalism, I didn't know anything about it. I blocked that out.
What's the name of that website?
Stanford Encyclopedia,
Okay.
yeah, SEP, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So they really do have great explanations of some of the theorists. But I wouldn't necessarily use that as the sole source for cutting framework cards, right? The other reason why I like going to the books is, like I said, if you actually pick up Rawls, sure, they'll give some great explanation of Rawls and the veil of ignorance and how that applies, but if you read the book, they go through and they say a lot of the same material, and then they go through and explain all the defense for it, right? And all the nuances that won't be in the encyclopedia, right? And so if you're running an ethical theory, I'd want to know what it says. You don't necessarily have to read the entire book, but I would definitely read enough of it so you have a very clear idea as to what they're talking about, right? Yes?
So like identifying specifically like different like deontology and utility, like social contract, you have like Hobbes and Locke. Like at any point you can like it's like good to identify like the specific like philosophers you're like establishing off of, or like util like act or stuff like that.
So I think it's very specific to the intent you're going for, right? So, for example, Hobbes, he's going to go through and explain that it's incredibly important to have security. The state of nature is horrible, it's abysmal, very scary. So we need an extremely, extremely strong state to be able to protect us, right? The problem is that, and Locke is kind of the opposite. He says, you know what, the state of nature really isn't that bad. There's some flaws. It'd be nice if we could kind of band together and have some more coherency, right? But ultimately, it's not too bad. So it's not all about security, but it's about trying to maximize our rights. So for Hobbes, he says, we need protection at all costs. This is deplorable. The other guy says, you know what? State of nature really isn't that bad, but we can make it better, right? So he's about maximizing rights. If I'm sitting there and I'm not talking about a major conflict between rights, and I'm not saying that things are absolutely horrible, I'm just saying that we need a little bit of protection. It's not violating rights to an extreme. I wouldn't necessarily say that we would go all the way to a monarchy, that we don't need to be afraid that much, the way Hobbes is thinking. I might just say, you know what, every government, whether you think Hobbes, whether you think Rousseau, whether you think Locke, it doesn't really matter. Every government would agree that we give up some rights in order to receive protection, right? And it wouldn't really matter which contract theories we're talking about. At that point, I might not really specify a theorist, right? Now, I probably would sit there and have a theorist in mind that if they pressed me on it, I'd be willing to defend. But I wouldn't necessarily go into the specifics of an author right here. But I would describe the overarching theme, okay? If I'm talking about utilitarianism, same concept. I wouldn't really go into that unless there was a specific reason to do so, right? But again, if someone pushed me on it, I know some theories I have stuff I'm comfortable defending, and that's what I would suggest, right?
So coming about distinguish me like the reason why you do like prefer your anticipation, how distinguish differ like in the framework?
Okay, so really it's pretty much the same thing as policy. Like in terms of where you guys will have a framework debate, the difference is we don't have the presumption that's about net benefits, right? And so we always have to outline the framework, right? The structure might be a little different. I'm not sure the exact structure that is traditionally used in policy, but where you can sit there and you can actually take out another flow and they'll go over it, and usually that's where like a critical debater and they'll go into roll the ballot or all that type of stuff, right? We just have this debate every single time. Sometimes we'll concede and like my value is morality and I say protect lives, sometimes that's your framework too. Then we'll just say, you know what, we agree, and we'll do a debate just like policy, right? The difference is, instead of just trying to figure out what the best policy option is, we're actually specifically asking the question of what's the ethical choice? And so we have to always start the round by asking what's the resolution, or what's the ethical choice that the resolution is telling us to act on. Does that make sense? So for policy, we kind of presume that and start talking about the policies, and the framework comes in there if we think that disagrees with, right? For us, the question is, what ethical choice should we follow, right? And so we have to start here, because if our value and then our criteria, etc., doesn't link to the resolution, nothing else matters, right? I can win all my arguments, but that's irrelevant. So they function the same, but we have to start here as opposed to policy. Any other questions so far? Yeah.
So you said making a chaos framework is different. How would it be different?
I wasn't necessarily saying that a framework would be different. They do tend to use rolled ballots, right? You don't have to. I have lots of critiques are run in very traditional formats, right? Most of the time, people don't recognize them as critiques, but it's the same critical authors, the same argument that's being run, and they'll use a traditional framework. What I was more discussing is that if I was going to run a critical app, for example, I wouldn't necessarily start the blogging process the same way. I still would list the arguments like this because I need to develop links. But that's what I'd be doing, is I'd be making a few blogs, but really researching links to the critique, because I know the critique I'm going to run. And so this process would look different, right? That's the big difference to me. Bless you. Any other big questions? So let's do one more example, okay? Just to make sure everyone has it. You guys are going to tell me how I'm going to do this. So step one, how are we going to link a value to the resolution? We're using the current topic. So what is the link? Yes. Ought equals moral obligation. Okay, so that's the link. So that makes my value equal morality. Okay. Someone suggest, you know what, before we do that, what standard are we going to do? Not like.
Decrease oppression.
Decrease oppression. Cool. Alright. So, someone make a theory. Someone use a theory. Yes. So, what ethical theory do you think would say, in order to be moral, we should decrease oppression? Okay, so you want to use deontology?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to use deontology. And what about deontology would say we should decrease oppression?
People can't be used as means to an end.
Perfect. To end. Might do a lovely clock card. Who knows, right? Something. Course card. Who knows? So now morality. I wouldn't necessarily state deontology, but we know what theory we're using. In order to be moral, we cannot treat means to an end. Kant would explain. Thus, my standard is decreasing oppression. Prefer decreasing oppression. Reasons to prefer. tell me a couple of reasons why it would be good to decrease oppression. Yes.
This would be a benefit for everybody in society.
This is something that impacts everyone, right? Sure. It's something that can be universalized in context, right? What else?
It promotes equality.
Promotes equality. Yeah, do that, sure. And we can say why equality is good. Sure.
This might be a little bit off, but you could say it decreases like suicide.
So what I would say, and you're probably right, but that's saying that decreases life, right? At that point, that's what because you're not going for the oppression deal at that point.
Okay.
What I would do, I would actually be a little sneakier about it. What I would do, if I wanted to run the suicide argument, and I was running the oppression deal, I would make the suicide argument one of my contentions. And when I list the impact, I would talk about how this type of bullying, etc., is really, really bad and is represented through the suicide. Like, that's a way that we can demonstrate oppression, right? It's very hard for me to tell if someone is joking or not, right? But if I know on a societal level suicide rates are going up, then we know that more people are being oppressed and it was bullying, not joking. So it's a way to be able to gauge it, right? I'll hide the argument like that. When my opponent then gets up there and they discuss a utilitarian framework, I'll extend my contention 1 subpoint A suicide argument and say not only is this important for recognizing how to decrease oppression, it also means we are able to save lives. So this argument links to both frameworks. See what I mean? That's how I would run that argument. What else? Yes. Sure. Increase quality of life. There we go. You guys just made a framework, and that took how long? 3 minutes? Not bad, right? Pretty simple. So this is the process of once I go through and I have all these arguments, obviously I'm ready to start debating. Then the real work kind of begins. That's when you start refining your cases. You start going through and seeing what people are going to respond to with your strong arguments, coming up with responses to those, doing all the work to defend your criterion by reading the books and finding the additional reasons and all the nuances with them, and you continue, work. Does that make sense? But in terms of getting initial prep ready to begin debating for any tournament, if you do all of this, by the time you have your case, you're ready to hit the ground running, and then everything else is just refining your cases, and at each tournament you realize some arguments work, some arguments don't work. You figure those out, and you keep improving the positions. Does that make sense? So, I don't really have anything else left for this lecture. Do you guys have any questions? Need anything? Cool. I think there's about 5 minutes left, so that's perfect. You guys can go to restroom, start heading to your next classes, or I guess we're doing group sessions. Okay.